If you grew up in the 1970s, you came from a world that no longer exists. Not just technologically, but emotionally, socially, psychologically. It wasn't a louder world. It wasn't faster. It wasn't optimized for comfort. It was slower, rougher, more direct. And without realizing it, that environment shaped you in ways that are becoming incredibly rare today. Back then, childhood didn't revolve around constant stimulation. There were long stretches of quiet, moments where nothing happened, times when you had to wait, not because someone wanted to teach patience, but because waiting was simply part of life. You didn't grow up being constantly reassured. You weren't praised for every small effort. You weren't told that your feelings were the center of the world. And yet, you survived. More than that, you adapted. You learned how to exist without constant attention, how to manage discomfort without an instruction manual, how to face boredom without panicking. The 1970s weren't idealized while you were living in them. They were just normal. But looking back now, it's clear something important was happening beneath the surface. A certain kind of strength was forming. Quiet, unannounced, unmeasured. And today, as the modern world struggles with fragility, distraction, and emotional overload, those traits stand out more than ever. This is not about saying one generation is better than another. It's about recognizing that different environments create different kinds of people. And if you grew up in the 1970s, you were shaped by limits, not by excess. That matters. Because limits force growth. Excess often weakens it. The traits you carry may not be visible on the surface. They don't announce themselves loudly. They don't trend online. But they influence how you think, how you respond under pressure, how you move through the world when no one is watching. And the first of those traits, the foundation for many others, is something most people today struggle deeply with. 1. Emotional resilience without needing validation. If you grew up in the 1970s, chances are you learned how to handle emotions without an audience. You didn't grow up broadcasting your inner life. You didn't grow up narrating every feeling. You didn't grow up expecting immediate understanding from others. When something hurt, you felt it. When something failed, you dealt with it. And most of the time, you moved forward quietly. That doesn't mean emotions were absent. It means they were personal. In your world, emotions weren't constantly analyzed in public. They weren't treated as identity labels. They were experiences, not definitions of who you were. You learned early that feelings pass, that frustration doesn't last forever, that disappointment, while painful, doesn't mean something is wrong with you as a person. Today, many people confuse feeling something with being something. Feeling anxious becomes I am anxious. Feeling rejected becomes I am unworthy. Feeling sad becomes I am broken. But you grew up before that shift. In your time, emotions were something you carried, not something you performed. And that distinction matters more than ever. Because the ability to experience emotions without needing constant external validation is one of the strongest forms of emotional resilience. You didn't need everyone to agree with how you felt. You didn't need reassurance at every step. You didn't need likes, comments, or approval to confirm your reality. You trusted your internal world, not because it was always comfortable, but because it was familiar. You learned how to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to escape it. That ability didn't come from therapy language or self-help books. It came from repetition. Life happened. You reacted. You adjusted. Over time, that repetition built a quiet emotional toughness. You became someone who could feel deeply without falling apart publicly. That doesn't mean you never needed support. It means you didn't depend on constant affirmation to function. In the 1970s, validation was scarce, attention was limited, and because of that, emotional self-reliance became normal. You didn't expect the world to pause for your feelings. You understood that people had their own struggles, their own burdens, their own limits. So you learned to manage your internal state independently. That independence is now rare. Many people today are emotionally exposed but internally fragile. They share everything, yet feel deeply unstable without feedback. You, on the other hand, learn stability first, expression second. You don't need to explain yourself constantly. You don't feel the urge to defend every emotion. You don't collapse when misunderstood. That's not emotional coldness. That's emotional grounding. You understand that being misunderstood is part of life, that disappointment doesn't invalidate your effort, that rejection doesn't erase your worth. Those lessons weren't taught directly. They were absorbed through living in a world that didn't revolve around the individual, a world where you had to adapt instead of being accommodated. That kind of emotional resilience doesn't shout. It doesn't advertise itself. It shows up in how you remain steady while others panic, in how you tolerate pressure without dramatizing it, in how you move forward even when no one is cheering. And because it's quiet, people often underestimate it. But when things actually get difficult, when comfort disappears, when reassurance runs out, that resilience becomes obvious. You don't fall apart easily. You don't need to be reminded of your value constantly. You don't need the world to validate every step you take. You know who you are, even in silence. That's not something you learned from motivation. That's something the 1970s gave you by default.
2. Patience in a world that now rushes everything. If you grew up in the 1970s, patience wasn't a virtue you tried to learn. It was something life quietly demanded from you. Waiting was normal. You waited for letters to arrive. You waited for shows to come on television at a specific time. You waited for results. You waited for adults to finish conversations before you spoke. And because waiting was unavoidable, you learned how to endure it without frustration controlling you. Patience wasn't framed as self-improvement. It was simply how the world worked. There were no instant responses, no immediate gratification, no feeling that every delay was a failure of the system. So your nervous system adapted differently. You learned that time passes whether you resist it or not, that not everything responds to urgency, that some things unfold only when they are ready. That understanding shaped how you move through life now, even if you've never put words to it. Today's world is built to eliminate waiting. Messages are expected to be answered immediately. Results are demanded quickly. Discomfort is treated as an error. But you were shaped before that expectation existed. You know that pressure does not speed up every process. You know that forcing outcomes often creates mistakes. You know that rushing rarely produces depth. Because you lived in a world where patience wasn't optional, it was structural. You learned how to stay calm during delays, how to tolerate uncertainty, how to trust that some things require time even when the outcome is unclear. That doesn't mean you lack ambition. It means you don't panic when progress is slow. You understand something many people struggle with today. Progress is not always visible while it's happening. In the 1970s, there were fewer visible milestones, no constant tracking, no instant feedback loops. So you learned to continue without reassurance. You did things without knowing immediately if they were working. You invested effort without guaranteed outcomes. You trusted the process before that phrase became popular. That builds a different relationship with time. You don't feel the same anxiety around delays. You don't spiral when results take longer than expected. You don't abandon effort just because progress isn't immediate. And in a world obsessed with speed, that patience looks like stillness. But it isn't passivity, it's confidence. It's knowing that time works with you when you don't fight it. You've watched enough seasons change to understand that everything meaningful takes longer than we expect. Careers, skills, relationships, wisdom. That perspective cannot be rushed into someone. It only forms when you grow up in a world that does not constantly reward impatience. And because you developed that patience early, you carry it into adulthood naturally.
When others grow restless, you stay steady. When others demand immediate clarity, you tolerate ambiguity. When others quit early, you continue quietly. That patience isn't dramatic, it isn't flashy, but it allows you to outlast trends, moods, and unnecessary urgency. And in the long run, the people who can wait without losing themselves are the ones who endure. 3. Self-reliance built from unsupervised freedom. If you grew up in the 1970s, you were given something that is almost unimaginable today: freedom without constant supervision. You were allowed to exist beyond direct oversight, to explore without a tracking system, to make decisions without immediate correction. Adults weren't hovering over every moment of your life. They didn't organize every minute. They didn't monitor your emotions in real time. And because of that, you learned self-reliance early. You learned how to assess situations on your own, how to solve small problems without assistance, how to navigate the world using judgment instead of instruction. That freedom wasn't reckless, it was formative. You learned what you could handle by being allowed to handle things. When things went wrong, you didn't immediately look for someone to fix it. You figured it out, or you lived with the consequence. That process built competence. Not confidence based on praise, but confidence based on experience. You trusted yourself because you had evidence that you could manage uncertainty. Today, many people struggle with decision-making not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack lived autonomy. They grew up under constant guidance, every step supervised, every mistake corrected early. But you grew up discovering limits through direct contact. You learned how far you could go by going there. That does something powerful to a person. It builds internal authority. You don't need someone else to constantly tell you what's right. You don't freeze when instructions are missing. You don't panic when there's no clear framework. You know how to figure things out as you go. That skill is subtle, but extremely valuable, because life does not come with constant guidance. Careers change, situations shift, problems arise without clear solutions. And when structure disappears, self-reliance is what remains. You don't need to be micromanaged to function. You don't need endless reassurance to move forward. You don't wait for permission to adapt. That doesn't mean you reject help. It means you don't depend on it for survival. You carry an internal sense of direction, not because someone programmed it into you, but because you had the freedom to develop it. You learned responsibility not from lectures, but from consequences. That kind of learning is durable. It doesn't fade when circumstances change. And in a world where many feel lost without external systems telling them what to do, your self-reliance quietly stands out. You may not think of yourself as exceptional, but you operate with a level of independence that others have never had to develop. And once that independence exists, it never fully leaves.
4. Respect for work, not status. If you grew up in the 1970s, work was not a performance. It wasn't branding. It wasn't identity decoration. It was responsibility. You didn't grow up watching people turn effort into spectacle. You didn't see constant self-promotion. You didn't see work framed primarily as self-expression. You saw it as something you did, not something you talked about. Adults around you worked because they had to, not because it looked impressive, not because it earned admiration. They worked because bills existed, because families needed stability, because effort was expected. That reality shaped your relationship with work deeply. You learned that work does not always feel meaningful in the moment, but it matters anyway. You learned that effort is not always rewarded instantly, but it still counts. You learned that contributing is more important than being seen.
That perspective is rare now. Today, many people chase status more than substance. They want the appearance of success before the discipline that creates it. They want recognition detached from responsibility. But you were shaped differently. You respect people who do the work, not those who talk about it. You notice consistency more than charisma. You value reliability over image. That doesn't mean you lack ambition. It means your ambition is grounded. You don't assume work owes you fulfillment every day. You understand that some days are simply about showing up, about doing what needs to be done, even when motivation is absent. That mindset keeps people steady over decades, not just bursts of enthusiasm. You learned that effort accumulates quietly, that small, repeated actions matter more than dramatic declarations, that real progress often looks boring from the outside. In the 1970s, status symbols existed, but they weren't the center of identity. What mattered more was whether someone could be trusted, whether they followed through, whether they carried their weight. Those values don't trend online, but they build societies. You don't feel the need to glamorize effort. You don't require praise to continue working. You don't confuse being busy with being important. And when others burn out chasing validation, you endure. Because your respect for work was built on necessity, not on image. That makes you stable in a way others struggle to be. 5. The ability to handle boredom and silence. One of the most underestimated traits you carry is this: you know how to exist without stimulation. If you grew up in the 1970s, boredom wasn't treated as a problem to solve immediately. It was part of life. There were no devices filling every pause, no constant noise, no endless input. Silence happened naturally. And instead of escaping it, you learned how to live inside it. That experience rewired how you think. You learned how to sit still, how to let thoughts wander, how to tolerate moments where nothing demanded your attention. That ability is disappearing fast. Many people today cannot handle silence without discomfort. They fill every gap with sound. They scroll not out of curiosity, but out of avoidance. But boredom did something different for you. It forced imagination, reflection, internal dialogue. You learned how to generate meaning from within instead of receiving it externally. That skill is subtle but powerful, because a person who can tolerate silence can think deeply. A person who can handle boredom can focus. A person who isn't afraid of stillness isn't easily overwhelmed. You don't panic when there's nothing happening. You don't feel the need to constantly distract yourself. You don't confuse stimulation with fulfillment. That gives you mental endurance. You can stay with difficult thoughts longer. You can process experiences without immediately escaping them. You can rest without needing entertainment to justify it. That doesn't make you disconnected. It makes you centered. In moments when others reach for noise, you remain present. When others feel restless, you feel grounded. When others need constant input, you are comfortable with less. And that comfort with silence creates clarity. It allows perspective. It allows patience. It allows depth. These are not traits that announce themselves, but they shape how you respond when life slows down or when it suddenly stops. You don't fear stillness, you understand it. And that understanding gives you an advantage few recognize until they lose it.
6. Accountability without blame culture. If you grew up in the 1970s, accountability was not a philosophical idea. It was a practical reality. When something went wrong, the first question was simple: what happened and what are you going to do about it? There wasn't a constant search for external causes. There wasn't an immediate shift toward blaming systems, environments, or abstract forces. That doesn't mean those things didn't exist.
It means responsibility came first. You learned early that actions have consequences, not symbolic consequences, real ones. If you didn't do something, it didn't get done. If you made a mistake, you dealt with the result. If you failed, you learned, sometimes painfully, and moved forward. That process shaped how you relate to life now. You don't instinctively look for excuses when things go wrong. You don't immediately search for someone else to absorb responsibility. You don't build your identity around victimhood. You may acknowledge unfairness, but you don't stay there. This doesn't make you harsh or unempathetic. It makes you grounded in reality. You understand that responsibility is not punishment, it is agency. Because the moment you accept responsibility, you regain control. The culture you grew up in understood that deeply. If you were responsible for something, you carried it, not forever, but fully. That taught you something many people struggle with today, that accountability is empowering, not limiting. You know that owning mistakes doesn't weaken you, it clarifies you. You don't need to protect your ego at all costs. You don't collapse when confronted with error. You don't confuse being wrong with being worthless. You correct. You adjust. You continue. That mindset keeps people moving forward while others remain stuck arguing about blame. In a world where responsibility is often avoided, your willingness to carry it makes you dependable. People trust you, even if they don't say it out loud. They know you won't disappear when things get difficult. They know you won't hide behind explanations. That trust is built quietly over time, and it lasts. 7. Quiet strength that doesn't need attention. The final trait you carry may be the most defining and the least visible. If you grew up in the 1970s, you learned how to be strong without announcing it. Strength wasn't displayed through slogans, it wasn't posted, it wasn't constantly explained, it was demonstrated. People did what needed to be done and moved on. You absorbed that model naturally. You don't feel the need to narrate your struggles. You don't require an audience to validate your endurance. You don't perform resilience. You live it. That doesn't mean your life has been easy. It means you don't define yourself by hardship. You understand that pain is part of life, not a personal injustice. You understand that resilience is built in silence, not in recognition. And because of that, your strength feels different. It's steadied instead of dramatic, measured instead of reactive, enduring instead of loud. When others burn out trying to be seen, you remain. When others talk about strength, you practice it. When others need affirmation, you rely on internal alignment. This quiet strength doesn't draw attention, but it draws respect. People sense it in how you carry yourself, in how you respond instead of react, in how you remain composed when situations become unstable. You don't need to prove resilience. You've lived it long enough to know it doesn't require proof. That kind of strength cannot be taught quickly. It cannot be downloaded. It cannot be simulated. It only forms through years of living without constant reassurance. And that is exactly how you grew up, what this generation carries forward. If you grew up in the 1970s, you may sometimes feel out of place in the modern world. Not because you were outdated, but because the environment changed faster than the values that shaped you. You live in a time that celebrates speed, visibility, and constant stimulation. You come from a time that built patience, restraint, and depth. That contrast can feel isolating, but it doesn't make you irrelevant. It makes you necessary. The world does not suffer from a lack of information. It suffers from a lack of steadiness. It does not lack opinions. It lacks grounding. The traits you carry are not relics. They are stabilizers. Emotional resilience, patience, self-reliance, respect for work, comfort with silence, accountability, quiet strength. These are not traits that dominate trends. They are traits that endure. And as the world becomes noisier, faster, and more fragile, the people who can remain steady without attention will become more valuable than ever. You don't need to change who you are to fit this era. This era needs more of what you already carry. And if you rarely hear that said out loud, it doesn't make it any less true.